In Victorian England, the worst punishment was not scandal, it was silence. Not the silence of contemplation or prayer or rest, the silence of withdrawal, the silence that greeted you when you entered a drawing room and no one turned, the silence that followed your words when you spoke and received no reply, the silence that wrapped around you like fog until you understood that you had become, in every meaningful sense, invisible. This was not cruelty in the way we understand it now. No one raised their voice. No one struck you. No one even necessarily spoke ill of you, at least not where it could be traced. Instead, they simply stopped speaking to you at all. They looked past you, through you. Their eyes moved across the space you occupied as if you were furniture. No, less than furniture, because furniture at least required acknowledgment, a slight adjustment of one's path, the small courtesy of avoidance. You could stand in a room full of people and cease to exist. This essay is about how that happened, how a society constructed an entire architecture of movement, posture, speech, and silence that allowed for this particular form of annihilation. How the rules governing every physical gesture, every pause, every breath became a system of control so total that most people never noticed they were being controlled at all. They simply learned to move correctly, speak correctly, sit correctly, stand correctly, until correctness became reflex and reflex became identity. We will walk through these spaces slowly. We will observe how bodies were trained, how silence was weaponized, how politeness concealed mechanisms of exclusion so efficient that they required no formal apparatus of punishment. We will see how fear operated not through what was said, but through what was withheld. How judgment worked not through condemnation, but through the simple absence of acknowledgment. And we will understand that for most Victorians, the threat they lived with was not the threat of scandal. Scandal could be survived, even transformed into a kind of terrible celebrity, but the threat of this particular silence, the threat of becoming a person to whom no one needed to respond, this was not an aberration. This was the system working exactly as designed, the grammar of posture. Before we can understand how silence functioned as a weapon, we must first understand how the body itself was read as a text. In Victorian England, posture was not merely physical, it was moral, spiritual, a revelation of character that could be interpreted by anyone who had learned the grammar. Consider how one was expected to sit. A lady sat upright, spine straight, without touching the back of the chair. This was not comfort. This was communication. The straight spine announced self-control, breeding, the proper subjugation of the body to the will. To lean back was to suggest laziness, sensuality, and unseemly comfort with physical ease. To slouch forward was even worse. It indicated either illness, weakness, or a failure of moral fortitude so complete that one could not even hold one's own body upright. But it was more complex than simple uprightness. The hands required attention. They rested in the lap, one over the other still, not fidgeting, not adjusting fabric, not touching the face, not performing any of the small unconscious movements that bodies make when left unmonitored. Each finger had its place. The thumb was never visible if it could be helped. Something about the thumb, thick and functional, suggested labor, effort, the kind of physical work that ladies were meant to be incapable of performing. Feet remained together, or very nearly so. Ankles crossed, perhaps, but never at the knee. That degree of separation suggested a kind of physical abandon that bordered on vulgarity. The angle of the ankle, the position of the heel, the tension in the arch of the foot, all of it legible to the trained observer, all of it contributing to an overall impression that could elevate or destroy. Men had different rules, but they were no less exacting. A gentleman sat with weight distributed evenly, legs together or slightly apart, never sprawled, never spread wide, in the manner that suggested he had forgotten he was being observed. The spine remained straight, but not rigid. Rigidity suggested military bearing, which was acceptable in certain contexts, but inappropriate in a drawing room. One arm might rest on the arm of the chair, but casually, as if the gesture required no thought. The other hand might rest on the thigh, fingers loose, but not too loose. You were relaxed, but you were not unconscious. To shift one's weight was to communicate discomfort, either physical or social. To adjust one's posture too frequently was to reveal anxiety, uncertainty, a lack of ease that suggested one did not truly belong. The ideal was a kind of motionless comfort, a stillness so complete it appeared effortless, natural, the body's default state, rather than a position maintained through constant vigilant effort. But of course it was effort, enormous effort. Children were trained to this stillness from the earliest age. Backboards were used, devices of wood and cloth that strapped to the spine and prevented slouching. Girls wore them for hours while they practiced their lessons, their needlework, their drawing. The body learned through discomfort, through the ache of held muscles, through the small violences of correction, until eventually the correct posture became muscle memory and the backboard could be removed. Boys, too, were drilled. Stand straight, shoulders back, chin level. Do not look down. Looking down suggested shame or deference or an unwillingness to meet the gaze of your betters. Do not look up too much either. That suggested servility, or worse, an inappropriate curiosity about things above your station. The eyes remained level, focused on a middle distance that allowed for awareness without staring, presence without aggression. Walking was similarly codified. A lady moved smoothly, without apparent effort, as if she glided rather than stepped. The hips remained still. The torso did not sway. The arms hung naturally at the sides or were folded at the waist, but they did not swing. To swing one's arms while walking suggested vigor, health, physicality, all of which were vulgar in a woman. One moved as if propelled by some mechanism other than one's own muscles, as if the body were simply a vessel being transported from one location to another by forces too refined to be named. The speed of movement mattered. Too fast suggested haste, anxiety, and unseemly urgency. Too slow suggested affectation, a deliberate performance of leisure that was itself a kind of vulgarity. The correct pace was moderate, steady, giving the impression that one had all the time in the world but was choosing graciously to arrive at the appointed moment. A gentleman's walk was equally regulated but differently performed. He moved with purpose, but without rushing. His stride was longer than a lady's, but not excessively so. No need to prove one's masculinity through the violence of one's gait. The arms might swing slightly, but from the shoulder, controlled, never from the elbow, in the loose manner of a workman. The head remained level. The eyes surveyed without appearing to search for anything in particular. When walking with a lady, the gentleman adjusted his pace to hers, which required a kind of constant recalibration, a perpetual awareness of her rhythm, her speed, the length of her step constrained by fabric and the rules governing how she was permitted to move. He offered his arm. She rested her hand upon it lightly, not gripping, not clutching, but barely touching, as if the contact were symbolic rather than physical, as if she could walk perfectly well on her own, but was choosing, out of courtesy, to accept this assistance. All of this was observable. All of this was being observed. In any social space, a drawing room, a garden party, a church, a street, there were always eyes. The eyes of servants who said nothing but noticed everything, and whose observations would be discussed in the kitchen, disseminated through networks of household staff that connected every family of consequence in a given area. The eyes of neighbors watching from windows, from doorways, from carriages passing in the street. The eyes of other guests, other pedestrians, other members of one's own social class who were simultaneously performing the same rituals and monitoring everyone else's performance. And beyond all these immediate observers, there was the larger apparatus of observation, the knowledge that anything you did might be reported, discussed, analyzed, interpreted by people you would never meet, in rooms you would never enter, until your reputation, that strange collective hallucination that determined your entire social existence, had been either confirmed or damaged. So you sat correctly, you stood correctly, you walked correctly. Not because you had made a conscious decision to do so, but because incorrectness had been trained out of you so thoroughly that your body no longer remembered how to move any other way. The posture was the person. There was no self beneath the performance. Or rather, if there was, it was irrelevant, because what mattered was not what you felt or thought or wanted, but what you communicated through the precise arrangement of your limbs, the exact degree of tension in your spine, the controlled rhythm of your breath, the cartography of space. Every room had its geography, every space had its hierarchy. Where you stood, where you sat, how close you came to another person, all of it was mapped, codified, subject to rules so complex that entire books were written explaining the proper arrangement of bodies in social space. Consider the drawing room. Upon entering, one paused. Not a long pause. That would suggest uncertainty, a lack of familiarity with the space or the people in it, but a brief pause, a momentary stillness that allowed the room to acknowledge you and you to acknowledge the room. The host or hostess would be seated, usually near the fire, if the season permitted, in the most prominent chair, the one that faced the door, so that all arrivals could be observed and greeted. You did not approach directly. You waited to be noticed. The hostess would look up, would smile, would perhaps gesture you forward. Only then did you move, and you moved to the exact spot where you had been implicitly directed, reading the angle of her hand, the direction of her gaze, the subtle indications that told you where you were meant to be. If you were a woman, you remained standing until invited to sit. If you were a man, you waited until the women had been seated, and then you found an appropriate location, not too close to any of the ladies, unless you were related to them or had been explicitly invited into conversation, but not so far away that you appeared to be removing yourself from the company. The geometry was precise. Too close suggested presumption, familiarity, and unseemly intimacy. Too far suggested disdain, boredom, a lack of interest in the social activity at hand. The servants moved through this space on their own paths, predetermined routes that took them around the periphery of the room, never crossing through the center where the quality sat, never requiring the guests to adjust their positions or acknowledge the servant's presence beyond the minimum necessary for practical function. A servant entered, delivered tea, retired. You did not follow them with your eyes. You did not interrupt your conversation to thank them. That would be to notice them, and to notice them would be to suggest that their service was somehow extraordinary, noteworthy, rather than simply the natural order of things. Distance between bodies was regulated by relationship and gender. A husband and wife might sit near each other, though not touching. Touching in public suggested a failure of self-control, a yielding to physical desire that was always somewhat vulgar even within marriage. Siblings maintained a moderate distance. Friends, depending on the depth of their friendship and the formality of the occasion, might sit close enough to converse quietly, but never so close that their clothing touched, their knees aligned, their bodies formed a unit separate from the larger social body of the room. Between men and women who were not married or closely related, distance was even more carefully calibrated, close enough to speak without raising one's voice, far enough that no one could suggest impropriety. The exact measurement varied depending on countless factors: the time of day, the presence or absence of a chaperone, the reputations of the individuals involved, the known relationship between their families, the current state of social opinion regarding each of them. And all of this was dynamic, constantly shifting. As people arrived and departed, as conversations formed and dissolved, as the light changed and the fire burned down and the tea was cleared away and new refreshments appeared, the entire configuration of the room transformed. Bodies moved in response to other bodies, maintaining the proper distances, the proper angles, creating and recreating the spatial grammar that made social life legible. To violate this grammar was to commit an error that everyone noticed, but no one mentioned. You stood too close to someone, and they shifted slightly away. You read the shift as discomfort with the temperature, or a desire to see the door, or any of 100 possible explanations that preserved the fiction that nothing untoward had occurred. But everyone in the room had seen it. Everyone had registered the initial violation and the subsequent correction. And everyone had filed this information away, added it to their cumulative assessment of you, your breeding, your suitability for continued inclusion in this social world. Or perhaps you sat when you should have remained standing. A more senior lady had not yet been seated, and you, in your ignorance or your exhaustion, or your simple failure to properly observe the room, had lowered yourself into a chair. The conversation continued. No one said anything, but the hostess's eyes flickered toward you for just a moment, and in that flicker was an entire communication. I have noticed. This has been registered. You have revealed something about yourself. The street had its own geography, no less complex. When walking, you kept to your side. When meeting someone of superior rank, you made way. If you were a woman, you did not walk alone, not in certain areas, not at certain times of day. If you were a man, you acknowledged other men of your acquaintance with a nod, a touch of your hat brim, a brief verbal greeting, calibrated to the degree of intimacy and the formality of the location. You did not stop to converse in the middle of the pavement. You moved to the side, creating space for others to pass. If the conversation extended beyond a few moments, you suggested relocating to a more appropriate venue, a park, a tea room, somewhere designed for social interaction rather than mere transit. You did not stare. Eyes moved across faces, across bodies, across the landscape of the street, but they did not fix, did not linger. To stare was to suggest either romantic interest, inappropriate in nearly all contexts, or hostile scrutiny, an aggressive examination that violated the tacit agreement that everyone was simply going about their business, visible but not invasively observed. And yet, of course, everyone was being invasively observed. Every gesture was noted, every item of clothing assessed for its appropriateness, its cost, its condition, every companion evaluated, every destination inferred from direction and pace and time of day. The street was a theater, and everyone was simultaneously performer and audience, playing their role while watching everyone else play theirs, the entire mechanism functioning through the shared fiction that no one was watching very closely at all. In the park, similar rules applied but with variations. One walked on the designated paths. One did not cut across the grass unless one was a child, and even children were expected to remain on the paths after a certain age. Benches were available for rest, but one did not occupy a bench for too long. That suggested idleness, a lack of productive purpose. One sat, one observed the landscape, one rose and continued one's walk. If you encountered an acquaintance, you acknowledged them according to the rules of the street. A nod, a greeting, a brief exchange. If the acquaintance was of the opposite sex and you were alone, the exchange remained very brief indeed, unless you were related or engaged or otherwise connected in a way that permitted extended conversation. An unmarried man did not walk beside an unmarried woman for more than a few moments without raising questions about his intentions and her judgment. Every space had these rules. The church had its seating arrangements, its order of entry and exit, its prescribed postures for prayer and listening. The theater had its boxes and stalls and galleries, each section corresponding to a social stratum. The entire building a physical manifestation of hierarchy. Even the cemetery had its geography, the most prominent families occupying the most visible plots, the poor relegated to the margins, the whole landscape of death reflecting and reinforcing the landscape of life. You learn to read these spaces. You learn to position yourself correctly within them. You learn to move through them without disrupting the patterns that everyone else was maintaining. And you learn that to violate the spatial rules was not merely a breach of etiquette, but a revelation of character, a sign that you had not properly internalized the logic that governed social existence, that you were not, in some fundamental sense, truly civilized. The discipline of silent speech was permitted. Of course it was permitted. Victorian society was not silent. Drawing rooms filled with conversation, dining tables hummed with exchange, letters crossed the country in volumes that are difficult to imagine now. But speech was regulated, channeled, controlled through a system of rules so intricate that what was not said often mattered more than what was. A pause in conversation was a complex event. Its meaning depended on who paused, when they paused, what had been said immediately prior, what was happening in the room around the speakers, the relationship between the people involved, the time of day, the formality of the occasion, the presence or absence of witnesses. If you asked a question and received no immediate answer, you waited. Not indefinitely. That would be to acknowledge that something unusual was occurring, to break the fiction that everything was proceeding normally. But you waited long enough to make it clear that you had asked a genuine question and expected a genuine response. How long was long enough? There was no precise measurement. You simply knew, through years of observation and practice, through the accumulated experience of thousands of similar moments, when the pause had crossed from normal into abnormal, from the standard rhythm of conversation into something else. And if the pause continued past that point, you understood that the silence was deliberate. The person you had addressed had chosen not to answer. They had not failed to hear you. They had not been distracted by some other stimulus. They had decided, for reasons they would never explain, that your question did not merit a response. You could not demand an answer. That would be to acknowledge the slight, to make it visible, to transform it from a subtle social maneuver into an overt conflict. So instead, you continued. You smiled. You turned to someone else, asked a different question, resumed the flow of conversation as if nothing had occurred. But you had received a message. You had been informed that you had transgressed some boundary, violated some unspoken rule, and the punishment was this: silence. This was more devastating than any insult. An insult could be answered, challenged, even embraced as evidence of the insulter's poor character. An insult required acknowledgment. The person who insulted you had noticed you, engaged with you, considered you worthy of their hostility. But silence required nothing. Silence was the withdrawal of engagement. Silence communicated that you were not worth the effort of insult, that you had ceased to register as a social entity deserving any form of response. And the beauty of it, from the perspective of the person deploying silence as a weapon, was that it left no evidence. There was no rude comment to be repeated, no scene to be described, no moment that could be pointed to and labeled as cruelty. There was simply a conversation that had continued around you, a question that had somehow gotten lost in the normal ebb and flow of social exchange, a moment that anyone could plausibly claim not to remember. But everyone remembered. Everyone in the room had heard your question and noted the lack of response. Everyone had watched you navigate the moment, had assessed how well you managed the slight, whether you revealed embarrassment or maintained composure. And everyone had filed this away. You had been found wanting in some way. You had been judged and sentenced, and the sentence had been carried out in full view of the company with such subtlety that no one could quite describe what had happened. Silence operated on larger scales as well. Entire conversations were avoided through the simple expedient of never raising certain topics. If you had suffered some misfortune, a financial setback, a family scandal, a romantic disappointment, it became unmentionable. Not forbidden, exactly. No one said you could not discuss it. But when you entered a room, the conversation shifted. When you joined a group, the subject changed. People were unfailingly polite, perfectly correct, and yet somehow the topics that you most needed to discuss, the support you most needed to receive, became impossible to access. This, too, was deliberate. The group had collectively decided that your misfortune placed you in a category that required a different kind of interaction. Perhaps they judged you responsible for your situation. Perhaps they found your circumstances embarrassing, a reminder of vulnerabilities they preferred not to acknowledge. Perhaps they simply did not know how to discuss the matter while maintaining the cheerful surface that social interaction required. Whatever the reason, the result was the same: isolation in the midst of company, the presence of sympathy without any actual support, the performance of concern empty of substance. You learned not to raise the forbidden topics yourself. To do so was to commit a social error that compounded whatever initial transgression had led to the silence. You learned to participate in conversations about trivial matters, to smile and nod and contribute observations about the weather, the theater, the latest fashions, while the thing that was destroying you remained perfectly, poisonously unspoken. And if you persisted, if you insisted on bringing up the forbidden subject, the silence deepened. People found reasons to end conversations with you. Invitations became less frequent. You discovered that you had developed a reputation as someone who made others uncomfortable, who violated the unwritten rules about what could and could not be discussed, who failed to understand that certain things were simply not talked about. The servants, of course, had mastered silence as a survival mechanism. They moved through rooms full of their employers and their employers' guests, hearing everything, seeing everything, and giving no sign that they had heard or seen anything at all. Their faces remained neutral, their eyes focused on their tasks. They had learned that to react, to smile at a joke, to look shocked at a revelation, to show any emotion in response to what was being said in their presence, was to remind their employers that they were human beings capable of judgment, and therefore potential threats to privacy and reputation. But this silence was also a kind of power. The servants knew things. They knew about the affairs, the debts, the addictions, the cruelties inflicted behind closed doors. They knew which marriages were genuine partnerships and which were armed truces. They knew who was kind and who was vicious, who kept their word and who lied as easily as breathing. And they shared this knowledge among themselves, creating a parallel social world in which reputations were built and destroyed on the basis of how one treated the people who brought the tea, who cleaned the grates, who laid out the clothes and brushed the hair and witnessed all the small moments when the performance of civilization dropped away. An employer who had lost the good opinion of their servants had lost something crucial. Word spread. Other servants knew to avoid that household. Good staff became difficult to retain. And while the employer might never know why they could not keep a reliable lady's maid, why their footmen always seemed to leave for better positions after only a few months, the effect was real. A slow degradation of domestic comfort, a creeping sense that something was not quite right, that the machinery of daily life was not functioning as smoothly as it should. But the servants never explained. They simply left one by one, and when asked for references, they provided them in language so carefully neutral that a knowledgeable reader could detect the warning. Mary served in the household for 6 months. Not I would recommend Mary without reservation. Not Mary was a treasure. Just the bare fact of employment. And the next potential employer reading that flat sentence understood. Something had happened. Something that could not be openly stated. And Mary had chosen to leave rather than endure it. This was silence as communication. Silence as a coded language that allowed for the transmission of crucial information while maintaining the surface appearance of propriety. And it functioned because everyone who mattered had learned to read it. The weight of observation. You were always being watched. This was the fundamental condition of Victorian social life, the premise that structured every interaction, every gesture, every word, not watched in the sense of surveillance exactly, though there was certainly that, but watched in a deeper sense, observed, assessed, interpreted, judged by an audience that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, that consisted of specific individuals whose eyes you could feel upon you, and also of a vast abstraction called society, public opinion, the world. The watching began in childhood. Nursemaids and governesses trained you to awareness, correcting your posture, your diction, your manners, reminding you constantly that you were being observed and that observation had consequences. Sit up straight. People are looking. Don't fidget. What would Lady So-and-so think? Smile properly. You never know who might be watching. The message was clear. You were never alone, never truly private, never free from judgment. Every moment was a performance, and every performance was being evaluated. In the schoolroom, you learned to monitor your own behavior, to become your own observer. You noticed when your handwriting became sloppy, when your voice rose too high, when you forgot to curtsy properly. You corrected yourself before the governess needed to correct you. The external discipline became internal discipline. The watcher at the door became the watcher in your mind, until eventually there was no difference between what you wanted to do and what you were supposed to do, because wanting anything else had become literally unthinkable. By the time you entered society, and entering society was a formal event, a ritualized transition from childhood to adulthood that involved specific garments, specific occasions, specific introductions. You had learned to exist in a state of perpetual self-awareness. You knew how you looked from the outside. You could see yourself as others saw you, or at least as you imagined others saw you, which amounted to the same thing in terms of behavioral control. At a ball, you were aware of your posture as you stood against the wall, waiting to be asked to dance. You were aware of your expression, pleasant but not too eager, composed but not cold, engaged with the room but not desperately scanning for a partner. You were aware of your hands, what they were doing, whether they were still or fidgeting. You were aware of your breathing, whether it was calm or betrayed anxiety. You were aware of being aware, and you knew that this awareness was itself being observed, that experienced chaperones could read desperation in the over-controlled stillness of a girl trying too hard to appear at ease. Every dance was a test. How well did you know the steps? Did you execute them with grace or mechanical precision? Could you converse while dancing, maintaining the rhythm of both movement and speech? Did you smile at your partner in a way that was friendly but not forward, engaged but not intimate? And when the dance ended, did you return to your chaperone with the correct degree of enthusiasm, neither gushing about what a wonderful time you had had, which suggested you did not dance often enough to consider it routine, nor appearing bored, which suggested ingratitude toward your partner? Every choice was laden with meaning. If you danced too often with the same partner, people noticed and began to speculate about an attachment. If you sat out too many dances, people noticed and began to wonder why you were not being asked. What deficiency had made you undesirable? If you danced with anyone who asked, you appeared undiscriminating, possibly desperate. If you declined dances, you risked appearing proud, particular, difficult. And all of this observation happened in real time, with no opportunity for explanation or context. Someone across the room saw you decline a dance and drew their conclusions. They did not know that you had twisted your ankle during the previous dance and needed to rest. They did not know that the gentleman who had asked was known to you as someone who made inappropriate comments, and you had no desire to spend a quarter hour in his company. They simply saw refusal, and they interpreted it according to their existing opinion of you, and their interpretation became part of the growing body of collective knowledge that constituted your reputation. The watching extended beyond formal social occasions. On the street, in shops, in church, you were visible. People noted what you wore, where you went, who accompanied you, how you conducted yourself. A woman seen entering a shop alone was observed differently than a woman accompanied by a servant. A man seen in certain neighborhoods at certain times was subject to speculation about his activities, his character, his suitability for respectable society. And because you knew you were being watched, you modified your behavior even when no one appeared to be present. You did not take the shortcut through the questionable neighborhood because someone might see you and wonder why you were there. You did not linger in front of the bookshop that sold controversial literature because someone might notice and assume you had gone inside. You did not speak to strangers, did not laugh too loudly, did not allow your face to express anything that could not be easily explained. The servants, of course, were the most constant observers. They were in your home, in your bedroom, handling your clothes, seeing you at your most vulnerable. They knew if you had been crying. They knew if you were ill. They knew if the bed sheet suggested your marriage was still physical or had become merely formal. They knew everything, and you knew they knew. And yet you had to maintain the fiction that they were not really there, that their knowledge did not count because they were servants, and therefore their observations did not matter. But their observations did matter. They talked among themselves. They talked to servants in other households. Information circulated through a network that was invisible to the upper classes, but no less real for being invisible. And sometimes this information surfaced in unexpected ways. A lady found that she could not hire a certain caliber of servant. A gentleman discovered that his valet had given notice and could not adequately explain why. The machinery of domestic life began to fail, and the failure was itself a form of judgment. A message from the serving class that something about this household, something about the way these people behaved when they thought no one important was watching, had been found unacceptable. The watching created a kind of paranoia, a sense that you could never fully relax, never be entirely yourself, whatever yourself might mean in a context where the performed self was the only self that mattered. You learned to be vigilant. You learned to notice who was noticing you. You learned to interpret glances, gestures, the small signs that indicated you were being observed with particular attention or particular judgment. And you learned to watch others with the same intensity. You became part of the observation apparatus, noting deviations from expected behavior, filing away information that might be useful later, contributing your small share to the collective surveillance that made deviation from the norm so costly. This was not experienced as oppression, at least not consciously. It was simply life. This was how society functioned. This was the price of civilization, of order, of the maintenance of standards that separated the respectable from the vulgar, the refined from the coarse, us from them. But beneath the acceptance, beneath the internalization of the watching gaze, there was exhaustion. The constant self-monitoring was tiring. The perpetual awareness of being observed drained energy that might have gone to other pursuits. The need to maintain the performance even in private moments, because Servants were present because neighbors might see through windows, because you had become so habituated to performing that you no longer knew how to stop, created a kind of permanent tension, a tightness that settled into the muscles and never fully released. You sat up straight even when alone in your room. You spoke in modulated tones even when no one but your family could hear. You dressed properly, moved properly, existed properly, because impropriety had become literally impossible, not through external enforcement, but through the complete internalization of the rules, the transformation of observation into self-observation, into the inability to imagine any other way of being, the mechanics of exclusion. Exclusion did not announce itself. There was no formal letter, no public declaration, no moment when someone told you that you had been cast out. Instead, there was a gradual diminishment, a slow withdrawal of the social oxygen that sustained your existence as a person of consequence. It began with invitations, or rather, with the absence of invitations. You noticed at first that you had not received an invitation to a particular event. This was not alarming. People forgot things. Invitations went astray. You assumed there had been an error, and you made no comment, because to comment would be to suggest that you had expected an invitation, and expecting invitations was vulgar, presumptuous, a violation of the code that required everyone to pretend that social engagements happened spontaneously, through mutual desire, rather than through calculated decisions about who was worth including. But then you failed to receive another invitation, and another. Events that you would ordinarily have attended, gatherings where you knew you would once have been welcome, proceeded without you. You heard about them afterward, in casual conversation, people mentioning the dinner party, the ball, the afternoon call, and you smiled and nodded as if you had been too busy to attend anyway, as if your absence had been your choice. No one said anything. No one needed to. The message was clear. You were no longer desired. Some transgression, some failure, some quality that you possessed or lacked had rendered you unsuitable for continued inclusion. What had you done? You might never know. The nature of your offense might never be explained because explaining would require conversation, and you were being excluded from conversation, from all the spaces where such explanations might occur. You continued to attend the events to which you had already been invited, the standing engagements that preceded whatever change had occurred in your social standing. But even at these events, you noticed differences. People greeted you, certainly. They were polite. But the conversations were shorter. Eyes moved past you more quickly, searching for more interesting interlocutors. When you spoke, people listened with a certain distant courtesy, and then they excused themselves and moved on. You were being tolerated. This was perhaps worse than being cut entirely, because it required you to witness your own diminishment, to sit in rooms where you had once been welcomed and feel the chill of collective indifference, to understand that you were being permitted to remain only because removing you would require an awkwardness that no one wanted to navigate, and you could not ask what had happened. To ask would be to acknowledge that something had changed, to break the fiction that everything was fine, that you were simply experiencing a natural fluctuation in social engagement. To ask would be to reveal that you had noticed, and noticing was a form of weakness, a sign that you cared too much about social acceptance, that you lacked the inner resources to exist independently of others' opinions. So you said nothing. You continued to dress properly, to attend the events still available to you, to maintain your end of the social contract, even as others were quietly withdrawing from theirs. You hoped that whatever had caused the shift would resolve itself, that you would somehow intuit the nature of your error and correct it, that the normal flow of social life would resume. But it did not resume. The invitations did not return. The conversations remained brief and cool. And gradually, you understood that this was permanent, or at least as permanent as anything in the shifting landscape of social opinion could be. You had been judged, you had been found wanting, and the sentence was this: isolation in the midst of society, the presence of social contact empty of actual connection, the experience of being seen and yet invisible, acknowledged and yet ignored. The cruelty of this system was its deniability. No one had done anything to you. No one had insulted you, rejected you, harmed you in any tangible way. They had simply failed to invite you, failed to seek out your company, failed to include you in their plans. And because these were all acts of omission rather than commission, there was no recourse, no way to challenge what was happening, no mechanism for defense or appeal. You could not accuse someone of not inviting you to their dinner party. That would be absurd. Invitations were gifts, freely given, and no one was entitled to receive them. You could not demand warmer conversation, more genuine interest, deeper engagement. That would be to reveal a desperate need that was itself socially fatal, that would confirm whatever judgment had already been made about your unsuitability. So you endured. You maintained your dignity. You continued to perform the rituals of social life with whatever grace you could muster, knowing that you were performing for an audience that had already lost interest, that was watching only to see how well you managed your descent, whether you would crack under the pressure or maintain the appearance of indifference to the end. Some people did crack. They became visibly desperate, trying too hard to regain what they had lost, laughing too loudly at others' jokes, offering compliments that bordered on flattery, seeking to purchase their way back into favor through excessive agreeability. This never worked. Desperation was repellent. It confirmed that the person had been correctly excluded, that they lacked the inner strength, the self-sufficiency, the proper pride that would allow them to accept their fate with grace. Others withdrew entirely. If society did not want them, they would not force themselves upon society. They retreated to their homes, their families, finding or claiming to find satisfaction in domestic life, in rural pursuits, in anything that allowed them to exit the social arena with some shred of dignity intact. This, too, was failure, but it was a more respectable failure, a choice rather than an abandonment, or at least it could be framed that way. And a very few, managed to navigate the exclusion without visible damage. They continued to appear at the events still available to them, maintained their composure, their standards, their performance of unconcern. They gave no sign that anything had changed, that they noticed anything amiss. They were perfectly pleasant, perfectly correct, and if they suffered privately, in spaces where suffering did not count because it was not observed. This last approach sometimes, not often but sometimes, led to a kind of rehabilitation. If you could endure the exclusion without showing distress, if you could maintain your dignity through the period of judgment, you might eventually be readmitted. Not to your former position, perhaps. There would always be a mark, a memory of the time when you had fallen from favor. But you could return to something like normal social existence. and the return would be marked by the same silence that had characterized your exclusion. No one would mention what had happened. The invitations would simply resume. The conversations would warm, and you would be expected to act as if nothing had occurred, as if the months or years of isolation had been merely a period of retirement, a personal choice that you were now reversing. But whether you were excluded permanently or temporarily, whether you withdrew or persisted, the mechanism was the same. The withdrawal of acknowledgment, the collective decision to treat you as less important, less interesting, less worthy of attention. And this decision was enacted not through cruelty, but through 1,000 small courtesies that concealed their poisonous intent, through politeness that created distance, through good manners that functioned as weapons of remarkable efficiency. No one needed to tell you that you had been cast out. You simply discovered, gradually and with increasing certainty, that you had ceased to exist in any meaningful social sense, that you had become a ghost haunting the edges of a world that had once been yours, visible but intangible, present but irrelevant, alive but socially dead. The language of courtesy, politeness, was the most sophisticated instrument in the Victorian social arsenal. It allowed for the infliction of injury while maintaining the appearance of civility. It permitted judgment to be communicated without words, exclusion to be enacted without confrontation, cruelty to be administered with a smile. Consider the simple act of calling. When a lady wished to call on another lady, she sent her card in advance, or simply arrived at the appropriate hour, the hour when the hostess was known to receive visitors. This was not an imposition. This was the normal functioning of social life. The hostess was at home, ready to receive, prepared to offer tea and conversation to whoever might appear. But if the hostess did not wish to receive a particular caller, she had options. She could instruct her servant to say that she was not at home. This was understood to be a polite fiction. The servant stood at the door, delivered the message with perfect neutrality, and the caller retreated. No one was deceived. The caller knew that the hostess was likely inside, simply unwilling to see her. But the fiction preserved everyone's dignity. The hostess had not been forced to reject the caller to her face. The caller had not been forced to endure an overt refusal, except, of course, that the refusal had occurred, the message had been delivered. And if the hostess was repeatedly not at home when a particular caller appeared, the caller understood that she was not welcome, that her visits were not desired, that she should cease attempting to maintain a connection that one party had clearly decided to terminate. This was rejection, but it was rejection administered with such courtesy that it could not be challenged. The caller could not accuse the hostess of rudeness. Nothing rude had occurred. A servant had simply reported that the lady of the house was not available. If the caller chose to interpret this as a pattern, as evidence of deliberate avoidance, that interpretation existed only in the caller's mind, and to voice it would be to commit a social error far greater than any that the hostess had committed. Similarly, when conversation was used as a weapon, it was wielded with exquisite politeness. Imagine a woman who had experienced some misfortune, a broken engagement perhaps, or a family scandal. She entered a room, greeted the company, and joined the conversation. The topic under discussion shifted immediately. Not obviously, not in a way that suggested her arrival had caused the shift, but shifted nonetheless. From the particular to the general, from the intimate to the abstract, from anything that might require genuine feeling to the sort of bland pleasantries that filled time without meaning anything at all. She tried to contribute. She offered observations, asked questions, attempted to steer the conversation toward topics of substance. And her attempts were met with pleasant agreement, vague acknowledgments, and then a smooth redirection back to the safe, empty territory that the group had collectively chosen to occupy. She could not object. Everyone was being perfectly polite. They were including her in the conversation, responding to her comments, giving every appearance of engagement. But the engagement was hollow. No real exchange was occurring. She was being managed, contained, kept at a safe distance through the deployment of courtesy so perfect it became a wall. And if she persisted, if she tried too hard to break through the wall, she risked becoming the rude one, the one who was violating the social contract by insisting on substance when everyone else had agreed to settle for surface. She would be marked as someone who did not understand boundaries, who could not read the room, who lacked the sensitivity to recognize when a topic was closed. Compliments, too, could function as weapons. What a charming dress! It must have been quite fashionable when you purchased it. The words were kind. The tone was sweet. But the message was clear. Your dress is outdated. You are behind the times. You lack either the means or the judgment to keep current with fashion. And you could not protest because you had been complimented. To suggest that the compliment was actually an insult would be to reveal yourself as suspicious, defensive, unable to accept gracious words with the grace they deserved. How well you manage with such limited resources, I confess I don't know how you do it. Again, sympathy, admiration even, but beneath the surface, acknowledgment of your poverty, your reduced circumstances, your inability to maintain the standards that others found so effortless. And the acknowledgment was delivered in a way that made challenge impossible. The speaker was expressing concern, offering support, recognizing your struggles. To object would be to suggest that you were ashamed of your situation, that you could not accept help or recognition with equanimity. Your daughter is so spirited. I'm sure she'll settle down eventually. Translation: your daughter is wild, uncontrolled, improperly raised, and you are failing as a mother. But the translation was never spoken. The words that were spoken were affectionate, even admiring. Spiritedness was a positive quality, wasn't it? And the assumption that the girl would settle down was optimistic, hopeful, a vote of confidence in her eventual maturity. But every mother in the room understood what had really been said, and they all smiled and nodded, and perhaps offered their own reassurances, maintaining the fiction that nothing unkind had occurred while simultaneously filing away the information. This woman's daughter was out of control, which suggested that the woman herself lacked authority, judgment, the capacity to maintain proper discipline in her household. Letters allowed for even more sophisticated exercises in hostile courtesy. The language could be formal, the sentences carefully constructed, the overall tone one of perfect respectability, while the content delivered devastating blows. Thank you so much for your letter. I was delighted to hear that you are well. Full stop. No engagement with anything the recipient had actually written. No response to questions. No comment on news. No acknowledgment of the substance of the communication. Just a bland expression of pleasure in the correspondent's continued health. And then nothing. The message: I received your letter, but found nothing in it worthy of response. You are not important enough to warrant my engagement with your concerns. I would be delighted to accept your invitation, but I fear I have a prior commitment that evening. No mention of what the prior commitment might be, no suggestion of an alternative date, no expression of regret that feels genuine, just the flat statement of unavailability, repeated over multiple invitations until the pattern became clear. I will never be available for you, but I will continue to phrase my unavailability in terms that prevent you from calling me rude. The genius of this system was that it could not be fought. To fight courtesy with confrontation was to lose immediately. You became the aggressive one, the one who had violated the rules, the one who had mistaken kindness for cruelty and responded inappropriately. You could not win by pointing out that you were being injured, because to point it out was to reveal that you had been injured, and being injured by mere courtesy was itself a sign of weakness, of oversensitivity, of a character defect that justified whatever treatment you were receiving. So you learned to speak the same language. You learned to deliver your own small cruelties wrapped in courteous words. You learned to smile while inflicting pain, to maintain perfect manners while excluding, rejecting, diminishing. You learned that politeness was not kindness, that courtesy was not compassion, that the most devastating things could be said in the gentlest tones if you had mastered the grammar of Victorian social interaction. And you learned to fear politeness. Real warmth was expressed differently, in small violations of perfect courtesy, in laughter that was slightly too loud, in gestures that were slightly too familiar, in all the small ways that people signaled genuine affection by breaking the rules that governed formal interaction. Perfect politeness meant distance. It meant caution. It meant that you were being assessed, managed, kept at arm's length. When someone was perfectly polite to you, you knew you were not safe. The hierarchy of acknowledgment. Not all people required the same degree of acknowledgment. Victorian society was stratified, and the strata were made visible through the precisely calibrated degrees of attention that different classes of people could demand. A duchess entering a room received immediate acknowledgment. Conversation paused. People rose if they had been seated, eyes turned toward her. She was greeted, welcomed, offered the best chair, the most prominent position. Her words, when she spoke, were listened to with attention. Her opinions were treated as significant. Her presence altered the entire dynamic of the room, and everyone adjusted their behavior in response to her arrival. A gentleman of moderate means, entering the same room, received a different acknowledgment, a nod perhaps, a brief greeting, continued inclusion in the conversation, but without any particular emphasis or special treatment. He was welcome, certainly, but his welcome was generic. The baseline courtesy extended to anyone who belonged to the same broad social category. A servant entering the room to deliver a message or tend to the fire received no acknowledgment at all, or only the bare minimum required for practical function. Eyes did not turn. Conversation did not pause. The servant existed in a separate sphere, performing necessary tasks, but not participating in the social life of the space, present but invisible in any meaningful sense. And this hierarchy of acknowledgment was not merely about class in the economic sense. It was about status, reputation, favor, the countless subtle gradations that determined who mattered and how much they mattered at any given moment. A woman who had recently married well received more attention than she had when she was merely the daughter of a respectable but unremarkable family. People sought her company, inquired about her opinions, included her in invitations, not because she had changed as a person, but because her social position had changed, and social position determined the amount of acknowledgment to which one was entitled. A man who had suffered a financial reversal found that he received less acknowledgment than before. People still greeted him, but the greetings were briefer, less warm. He was still invited to some events, but fewer than previously, and to less important ones. His words in conversation were listened to politely, but not given the weight they had once carried. He had slipped down the hierarchy, and the entire social apparatus adjusted its response to him accordingly. This adjustment happened without announcement, without explanation. People did not say, "You are less important now, so I will pay less attention to you." They simply did pay less attention, and the person experiencing the shift had to interpret its meaning, had to understand that they were being informed of their diminished status through the precise measurement of how much acknowledgment they received. And the withdrawal of acknowledgment could be so subtle that it was almost imperceptible, a matter of degrees rather than absolute presence or absence. You spoke, and people listened, but their eyes drifted slightly, not enough to be rude, but enough to signal that their attention was not fully engaged. You asked a question, and you received an answer, but the answer was brief, perfunctory, lacking the elaboration that suggested genuine interest in the exchange. You entered a room, and people greeted you, but the greeting was mechanical, performed out of obligation rather than pleasure. These were small things. Any single instance could be explained away as distraction, preoccupation, the normal variation in human attention and energy. But cumulatively, they formed a pattern, and the pattern was legible to anyone who had learned to read it. You were being downgraded. Your position in the hierarchy was being adjusted downward, and the adjustment was being communicated through the careful modulation of how much acknowledgment you received. This system was efficient because it was self-enforcing. Once a person's status began to decline, others noticed the decline and adjusted their own behavior accordingly, which accelerated the decline, which prompted further adjustment until the person found themselves in a much lower position than they had occupied previously. And because each individual adjustment was small, reasonable, justifiable, why should I pay special attention to someone who is clearly losing favor? No one could be blamed for the collective result. The person experiencing the decline could not point to any specific act of cruelty. They could only describe a general sense of being less welcome, less valued, less important. And to describe this was to risk sounding paranoid, oversensitive, insufficiently secure in one's own worth. Confident people did not worry about such things, did they? Confident people did not notice the small fluctuations in how much attention they received. So, to notice, to care, to be hurt by the withdrawal of acknowledgment was itself evidence of a character flaw that justified the withdrawal. Conversely, rising in status brought increased acknowledgment, and the increase was intoxicating. Suddenly, people wanted your opinion. They asked you questions and waited for the answers. They included you in their plans, sought your company, made it clear that they valued your presence. You had not necessarily changed. You had not become more intelligent, more charming, more worthy, but your position had shifted, and the shift had triggered a recalibration of how much acknowledgment you deserved and the acknowledgment felt like validation, like proof that you had been right to pursue whatever strategy had led to your elevation. And so the system reinforced itself. People competed for acknowledgment, adjusted their behavior to maintain or improve their position in the hierarchy, internalized the logic that made acknowledgment the measure of worth. To be acknowledged was to exist. To be ignored was to be nothing. The servants, watching all of this from their invisible position, understood the system perfectly. They saw how their employers craved acknowledgment, how they angled for position, how they suffered when they received less attention than they believed they deserved, and the servants knew that they themselves existed in a category so low that acknowledgment was not even a possibility. They were functionally invisible, acknowledged only when necessary for practical purposes, otherwise existing in a parallel world that touched the world of their employers only at the points of service. But within their own hierarchy, acknowledgment functioned in exactly the same way. A lady's maid received more acknowledgment from other servants than a scullery maid. A butler commanded respect and attention that a footman could not. Status differences within the servant class were maintained through the same mechanisms of acknowledgment and withdrawal that governed the classes above them. The entire society was structured on this principle. From the lowest servant to the highest aristocrat, everyone existed within a hierarchy of acknowledgment. Everyone understood their position through the precise measurement of how much attention they received and from whom. Everyone learned to read the small signals that indicated shifts in status, elevation or decline, favor or disfavor. And because acknowledgment was so carefully rationed, its absence was devastating. To be in a room full of people and receive no acknowledgment was to experience a kind of death. You could see, hear, feel your own presence, but no one else confirmed it. You spoke and were not heard. You moved and were not noticed. You existed in your own consciousness, but nowhere else. And the gap between your internal sense of existence and the external evidence of your non-existence created a particular kind of psychological pain that was difficult to describe and impossible to remedy, because you could not demand acknowledgment. Acknowledgment, by definition, had to be freely given. To ask for it was to reveal that you lacked the qualities that would make it naturally forthcoming, and the revelation itself ensured that you would continue to lack it. So you endured the absence. You maintained your dignity. You continued to perform the rituals of social life even when those rituals no longer connected you to other people, even when you had become a ghost going through the motions in a world that had decided you no longer mattered. The internalization of surveillance. By the time a person reached adulthood in Victorian society, they had become their own most vigilant observer. The external mechanisms of control, the watching eyes, the judging voices, the subtle signals of approval and disapproval had been so thoroughly internalized that they functioned automatically below the level of conscious thought. You did not need anyone to tell you to sit up straight. Your body had learned that slouching produced discomfort not in the muscles, but in the mind, a vague sense of wrongness, of having violated some essential principle. The posture had become identity. You were a person who sat up straight, and any deviation from that posture felt like a deviation from yourself. You did not need anyone to remind you to speak in modulated tones. Your voice had found its correct register through years of correction and practice, and to raise it or lower it beyond the acceptable range felt unnatural, almost impossible. The voice was not something you controlled, it was something you were, and its parameters had been established so long ago that you could not remember a time when you had spoken any other way. You did not need anyone to warn you about improper topics of conversation. You had learned which subjects were permitted and which were forbidden so thoroughly that the forbidden topics did not even occur to you as possibilities. They existed outside the realm of the speakable, in a space that your mind did not access, because accessing it would serve no purpose. You could not say these things, so why think them? This internalization was the system's greatest achievement. It meant that control no longer required external enforcement. You enforced the rules upon yourself, constantly, unconsciously, with a vigilance that no external observer could match because you were always present to yourself, always aware of your own thoughts and impulses, always ready to correct any deviation before it became visible to others. The process had begun in childhood with explicit instruction and correction, but it had continued through years of observation and imitation, of seeing how others behaved and modeling your own behavior on theirs, of noticing what was rewarded with acknowledgment and what was met with silence or disapproval, of slowly, gradually, almost imperceptibly adjusting yourself until you fit the template, until you had become the kind of person who naturally, effortlessly conformed to the expectations of your class, your gender, your position. And the adjustment was not merely behavioral, it was psychological. You did not simply learn to act properly, you learned to want to act properly, to feel satisfied when you conformed and anxious when you deviated. The external rewards and punishments that had initially motivated conformity became unnecessary because conformity itself had become rewarding and deviance itself had become punishing. This was not experienced as oppression. You did not feel controlled because the control was not external to you. It was you. Your sense of right and wrong, proper and improper, acceptable and unacceptable had been shaped by the society you lived in, but it felt like your own judgment, your own standards, your own freely chosen values. When you corrected your posture, you were not obeying some external authority. You were simply being yourself, the self you had been trained to be so thoroughly that no other self was imaginable. When you avoided certain topics of conversation, you were not censoring yourself. You were simply not interested in those topics, had nothing to say about them, found them distasteful or irrelevant in ways that felt entirely natural. When you chose your words carefully, monitoring their potential impact, considering how they would be received and interpreted, you were not engaging in calculated performance. You were simply being thoughtful, considerate, polite, qualities that you valued and that you had learned to embody without conscious effort. But beneath this apparent naturalness, beneath the sense that you were simply being yourself, the mechanisms of control continued to operate. You monitored your own thoughts, noticed when they strayed toward forbidden territory, gently redirected them. You observed your own behavior, constantly comparing it to the internal template of correctness that you had developed over years of socialization. You judged yourself according to the standards that had been imposed upon you so long ago that they felt like your own standards, and you experienced satisfaction or shame depending on how well you met them. And this self-monitoring was exhausting, even when you were not conscious of performing it. It required energy to maintain the constant vigilance, to notice every small deviation, to correct every impulse that did not align with the approved template. The exhaustion was rarely acknowledged because acknowledging it would suggest that conformity was difficult, unnatural, something that required effort rather than simply being who you were. But sometimes, in private moments, you felt it. A weariness that went beyond physical tiredness. A sense that you could never fully rest, because rest would mean letting go of the vigilance. And letting go of the vigilance would mean risking some error, some slip, some revelation of a self that was not entirely proper, not entirely acceptable, not entirely the person you had been trained to be. And yet you could not articulate this exhaustion, could not explain it even to yourself, because to do so would require acknowledging that there was a gap between who you were and who you appeared to be, and acknowledging that gap would undermine the entire structure of identity that you had so carefully constructed. So you continued. You maintained the vigilance. You monitored yourself, corrected yourself, shaped yourself according to the template. And you called this freedom because you had chosen it. Or at least you had forgotten that there had ever been a moment when you had not chosen it, when the choice had been made for you by forces outside your control. The servants, of course, had internalized a different set of rules. They had learned to move quietly, speak deferentially, keep their opinions to themselves, maintain the fiction of invisibility that allowed them to function in the households of the upper classes. And they had learned these things so thoroughly that they felt natural, not a performance, but simply the way one behaved, the way one was. But the servants also knew, in a way that their employers often did not, that the self they presented was a construction. They knew because they had two selves, the one they showed to their employers and the one they showed to each other. In the servants' hall, they spoke differently, moved differently, expressed opinions and emotions that would have been unthinkable in the presence of the family. They had not internalized the rules as completely as their employers had, perhaps because the rules governing servant behavior were more obviously imposed from outside, less easily mistaken for natural expressions of character. Or perhaps they had simply developed a kind of double consciousness, an ability to perform the required role without entirely identifying with it, to maintain some core of selfhood that existed independently of the performance. But for the upper classes, for the people who had been trained from birth to believe that their way of moving, speaking, and being was the only correct way, the only civilized way, the internalization was nearly complete. They were the performance. There was no self beneath the surface that was meaningfully different from the self on display, because the surface had become the substance, the performance had become the person, and any impulses or desires that did not fit the template had been so thoroughly suppressed that they rarely surfaced even in private moments. This was control at its most efficient. When people controlled themselves more effectively than any external force could control them, when they wanted to conform and feared deviation, not because of external punishment, but because deviation violated their own sense of identity, the system had achieved its ultimate goal, and the achievement was invisible. It looked like freedom. It felt like freedom. People believed they were making their own choices, living according to their own values, being their authentic selves. They did not recognize the architecture of constraint that had shaped those choices, those values, that sense of self. They did not see the surveillance they had internalized, the judgment they had incorporated, the control they now exercised upon themselves with a thoroughness that no external authority could match. They simply lived. They sat up straight, spoke properly, maintained the correct distances, observed the proper silences, and they experienced all of this as natural, right? The way civilized people behaved. And when they encountered someone who deviated from the template, they felt genuine shock, genuine offense, genuine conviction that the person had revealed a flaw of character, because the rules had become reality. What was proper was what was real, and anything outside the bounds of propriety was not merely incorrect, but impossible, a violation of nature itself. This was the deepest level of control, not the enforcement of behavior, but the shaping of perception, the creation of a reality in which conformity was the only possibility. Deviation was literally unthinkable, and freedom consisted of the ability to choose among the narrow range of options that the system had designated as acceptable. The architecture of scandal was survivable. This sounds paradoxical, given the Victorian reputation for prudery and propriety, but it was nevertheless true. A scandal, a broken engagement, an affair, a bankruptcy, a public quarrel, was a discrete event. It had a shape, a narrative, a beginning, and an end. It could be discussed, analyzed, judged, and because it could be discussed, it could eventually be exhausted. People tired of talking about it. New scandals emerged to displace it. The person at the center of the scandal might be damaged, but they remained visible, acknowledged, part of the social conversation, even if the conversation was condemnatory. Silence was different. Silence had no shape. It was not an event, but an absence. It could not be discussed because there was nothing to discuss. You had not been invited. You had not been spoken to. You had not been included. And none of these absences constituted a topic that could be raised in polite company. Silence had no beginning that you could identify, no end that you could anticipate. It simply was a condition that might last weeks or months or years or forever, with no indication of when or whether it might change. And silence left no possibility for rehabilitation through explanation or apology. In a scandal, at least, you knew what you were accused of. You might be able to deny it, or explain it, or express contrition. You had something to work with, some material from which you could construct a defense or a plea for forgiveness. But when you had been silenced, you often did not know why. You could guess. Perhaps you had committed some social error, or perhaps someone had spread a rumor about you, or perhaps you had simply failed to please in some indefinable way. But you did not know, and you had no way to find out, because the people who might have told you were no longer speaking to you. Some attempted to break the silence through direct confrontation. They approached someone who had been avoiding them and asked directly what they had done to give offense. This almost never worked. The person being confronted would profess ignorance, would claim that nothing was wrong, would insist that any perceived coolness was imaginary. Because to admit that you had been deliberately avoiding someone, deliberately withdrawing acknowledgment, would be to commit a social error greater than whatever the other person had done. It would be to reveal the cruelty beneath the courtesy, to break the fiction that social life proceeded through natural affinity rather than calculated inclusion and exclusion. So the confrontation achieved nothing except to confirm the confronter's desperation, which further justified their exclusion. A person who could not gracefully accept being ignored, who demanded explanations and reassurances, was clearly not suited to civilized society. Others attempted to rehabilitate themselves through exemplary behavior. They dressed more carefully, spoke more correctly, adhered more strictly to every rule of etiquette, hoping that if they could just be proper enough, acknowledgment would return. This, too, rarely worked, because the problem was not impropriety, or at least not anymore. The problem was that they had been marked as someone who was being ignored, and that marking itself became the reason for continued ignoring. To acknowledge someone who was being collectively ignored would be to break ranks with the group, to risk being associated with someone of questionable status, to potentially incur the same treatment yourself. So the exemplary behavior went unnoticed, or noticed but not rewarded, and the person performing it eventually exhausted themselves trying to meet standards that were irrelevant to their actual situation. A scandal, by contrast, provided something concrete to work with. If you had been caught in an affair, you could leave town for a period of time, allowing the immediate shock to fade. You could behave with particular discretion upon your return, demonstrating that you had learned your lesson. You could leverage family connections, social capital, whatever resources you possessed to gradually rebuild your position. The process was difficult, certainly. You would never entirely escape the scandal. It would be remembered, referenced, used against you when convenient. But it was possible to move forward, to create a new narrative in which the scandal was an unfortunate episode in an otherwise respectable life, to slowly, gradually, through patient adherence to propriety, recover most of what you had lost. But silence offered no such path. There was no dramatic exit and return because you had never left. There was no opportunity to demonstrate reform because you had never been told what needed reforming. There was no leverage to apply because you were not being punished for anything specific, just quietly, persistently not acknowledged. And the psychological impact was different. A scandal was humiliating, certainly, but humiliation at least confirmed your existence. People were talking about you, judging you, condemning you. You were the center of attention, even if the attention was negative. You mattered enough to provoke strong reactions. Silence communicated that you did not matter at all. You were so unimportant that no one needed to condemn you. You had simply ceased to be relevant. You could be in the same room with people, and they would look through you as if you were not there. And the looking through was not aggressive or hostile, but simply indifferent, the natural response to something beneath notice. This produced a particular kind of psychological erosion. You began to doubt your own perceptions. Had you really been excluded, or were you imagining it? Were people really avoiding you, or were you being paranoid? The absence of clear signals, of definitive evidence, made it impossible to trust your own interpretation of what was happening. And yet you felt it, undeniably, the chill in the air when you entered a room, the slight but unmistakable withdrawal that greeted your attempts at conversation, the sense that you were somehow wrong in ways you could not identify or correct. Some people, experiencing this erosion, began to withdraw from social life voluntarily, not because they wanted to, but because the constant uncertainty, the perpetual second-guessing, the exhausting effort of trying to connect with people who did not want to connect with you became unbearable. It was easier to stop trying, to accept isolation, to retreat into whatever private life you could construct outside the social arena. This withdrawal was then interpreted as confirmation that the person had been correctly excluded. They had proven themselves unable to function in society, unable to maintain the connections and obligations that defined social existence. The withdrawal was not seen as a response to exclusion, but as evidence of a character flaw that had necessitated exclusion in the first place, and so the system closed around itself. Silence produced withdrawal. Withdrawal produced further silence, and the entire cycle was interpreted as natural, appropriate, the inevitable result of someone being unsuited to the social world they had attempted to inhabit. The servants saw all of this. They saw the people who were being silenced, watched them navigate the drawing rooms and dining rooms where they were no longer welcome, observed the desperate attempts to regain acknowledgment or the quiet acceptance of invisibility. And the servants understood, perhaps better than their employers, how the system worked, because they lived on its margins, always potentially subject to the same mechanisms of exclusion if they failed to perform their roles correctly. But the servants also had their own social world, separate from their employers, where different rules applied and different forms of acknowledgment were possible. They could be silenced in one world and still exist in another, which provided a kind of buffer against the complete annihilation that silence could produce in people who had no other world to retreat to. For the upper classes, for those whose entire identity was bound up in social acknowledgment, whose sense of self depended on being seen, recognized, included, silence was a kind of death. Not physical death, but the death of the social self, the self that mattered, the self that they had spent their entire lives constructing and maintaining. And because this death was invisible, because it happened without event or ceremony, because it could not be mourned or marked or even definitively identified, it was in some ways worse than physical death. It was erasure. It was the discovery that you could be present and absent simultaneously, alive in your own consciousness, but dead to everyone else, a ghost haunting your own life. The texture of fear. Fear in Victorian society was not dramatic. It was not the fear of violence or disease or sudden catastrophe, though those fears certainly existed. It was a quieter fear, a constant low-level anxiety that permeated daily life. The fear of making an error, of being judged, of losing position, of discovering that you had been unknowingly transgressing and were now being punished through mechanisms too subtle to challenge. This fear lived in the body. It resided in the tension in your shoulders as you sat in a drawing room, aware that your posture was being observed. It manifested in the slight tightness in your throat when you spoke, the unconscious monitoring of tone and volume and content. It expressed itself in the constant small adjustments you made to your position, your expression, your words, each adjustment a response to the perceived expectations of the people around you. You learned to read faces for signs of disapproval, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a barely perceptible tightening of the mouth, a change in the quality of attention. All of these could indicate that you had said or done something wrong, and you learned to notice them instantly, to adjust your behavior in response, to try to recover from whatever error you had committed before it became a topic of discussion or a mark against your reputation. But you could never be certain that you had read the signs correctly. Perhaps the narrowing of the eyes had been caused by something entirely unrelated to you. Perhaps you had imagined the tightness in the mouth, Perhaps the change in attention was natural, simply the ebb and flow of interest that occurred in all conversations. Your interpretation might be wrong, but you could not afford to ignore the signs, because ignoring them when they were real would be worse than responding to them when they were imaginary. So you lived in a state of perpetual uncertainty, always watching for signs, always trying to interpret them, always adjusting your behavior based on interpretations that might or might not be accurate. This produced exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of physical labor, but the exhaustion of constant vigilance, of never being able to fully relax, of always being on stage, always performing, always aware that a single mistake could have consequences that would ripple through your social life in ways you could not predict or control. And the exhaustion was compounded by the fact that you could not acknowledge it. To admit that social life was tiring, that maintaining the correct performance required effort, would be to suggest that you were not naturally suited to your position, that the behavior that was supposed to come effortlessly to a person of breeding required conscious work on your part. So you hid the exhaustion, maintained the appearance of ease, and added the effort of hiding to the effort of performing, creating a cycle that intensified over time. The fear was particularly acute around moments of potential judgment, entering a new social circle, meeting someone of higher status, attending an event where you were not entirely certain of the expectations. In these moments, the anxiety sharpened, became something you could almost taste, a metallic edge to your awareness that made everything feel precarious, dangerous, full of potential for disaster. You prepared obsessively. You reviewed the rules, the protocols, the things you should and should not say or do. You planned your entrance, your greetings, your exit. You imagined scenarios, scripted responses, tried to anticipate every possible situation so that nothing would catch you unprepared. And yet, despite all the preparation, you knew that you could not account for everything. Social interaction was too complex, too dependent on context and nuance, and the unspoken expectations of the moment. Something unexpected would occur, and you would be forced to improvise, and the improvisation might reveal some gap in your training, some failure of judgment, some quality that marked you as not quite belonging. The fear of this revelation was constant. You might be performing perfectly now, but at any moment you might make an error, and the error might be the thing that shifted you from included to excluded, from acknowledged to ignored, from someone who mattered to someone who did not. And because the consequences were so severe and so difficult to predict, the fear was never entirely absent. It colored every interaction, every word, every gesture. It was the background noise of social existence, the ever-present awareness that you were being judged and that the judgment could go against you at any time for reasons you might never fully understand. Children learn this fear early. They learned it from the constant corrections, the endless reminders to sit up straight, speak properly, behave correctly. They learned it from seeing adults navigate social situations with visible anxiety, from overhearing conversations about who had been invited where and who had not, from absorbing the unspoken message that position was precarious, that belonging was conditional, that safety lay only in perfect adherence to rules that were never completely explained. By adolescence, the fear had been internalized. You no longer needed external reminders because you had developed your own internal critic, always watching, always judging, always ready to point out potential errors, before they became visible to others. The internal critic was merciless, more demanding than any external authority, because it had access to your thoughts, your impulses, your desires, and it could judge not only what you did, but what you wanted to do, what you imagined doing, what you feared you might do if you lost control for even a moment. This internal surveillance created a kind of split in consciousness. Part of you experienced the world, wanted things, felt things, responded spontaneously to stimuli. Another part observed that experiencing self monitored its impulses, corrected its inclinations, ensured that nothing inappropriate surfaced into behavior or even into full conscious awareness. The observer was exhausting. It never rested. It could not be distracted or lulled into inattention. It was vigilant in a way that no external observer could be, because it was always present, always aware, always performing its function of maintaining the boundary between the acceptable self and the unacceptable impulses that threatened to disrupt it. And yet, the observer was so integrated into your sense of self that you rarely noticed it. You did not experience yourself as split. You simply experienced yourself as someone who naturally wanted to behave correctly, who naturally felt anxiety about potential errors, who naturally monitored every word and gesture to ensure propriety. The observer was you. Or rather, you had become the observer, and the spontaneous experiencing self had been so thoroughly trained and suppressed that it rarely made its presence felt. But sometimes, in moments of privacy or exhaustion, you felt the gap. You felt the effort of maintaining the performance, the weight of the constant monitoring, the fatigue of never being able to simply be without simultaneously observing your self-being. And in those moments, you understood, however dimly, that you were living in fear, that the fear had shaped you so completely that you had mistaken it for normal consciousness, that what you experienced as yourself was actually a construction designed to protect you from the consequences of being yourself. But you could not act on this understanding. To rebel against the fear, to attempt to exist without the constant monitoring, would be to risk everything. So, you continued. You maintained the vigilance. You lived with the fear, and you called it virtue, dignity, self-respect, anything but what it actually was. The successful internalization of social control, the transformation of external threat into internal discipline, the creation of a self whose primary function was to monitor and correct its own impulses in service of a social order that demanded nothing less than total conformity. The economy of attention was currency. This was understood by everyone who participated in Victorian social life, even if it was never stated explicitly. How much attention you received from whom, under what circumstances, all of this determined your value, your position, your prospects, your entire social existence. A young woman entering society needed attention from the right people. Not too much attention, that would suggest impropriety, a worrying eagerness that bordered on desperation, but enough attention to establish that she was worth noticing, that she possessed the qualities that made a woman desirable: beauty, breeding, accomplishment, an appropriate dowry, a family of sufficient standing. The attention had to be calibrated precisely. Older women, established matrons, paid attention to determine whether she was suitable for inclusion in their circles. Men of appropriate age and station paid attention to assess her suitability as a potential wife. Her peers paid attention to determine where she fit in the complex hierarchy of desirability that governed their own social calculations. And she had to manage all of this attention carefully. Too much responsiveness to male attention suggested improper forwardness. Too little suggested coldness, a lack of the warmth and charm that were essential feminine qualities. Too much eagerness for female approval suggested social climbing, an awareness of status that was vulgar even though everyone was constantly aware of status. Too much aloofness suggested pride, a belief in her own superiority that was unbecoming even in someone of the highest rank. The goal was to appear natural, effortless, as if all of this attention was simply happening to her rather than being something she was actively managing. The management had to be invisible. The calculation had to be concealed beneath a surface of spontaneous grace. For young men, the dynamics were different, but no less complex. A man needed attention from potential mentors, from the fathers of eligible young women, from the social and professional networks that would determine his career prospects. He needed to be noticed, but not in a way that suggested striving, ambition untempered by breeding, the kind of naked desire for advancement that was acceptable in trade but vulgar in a gentleman. He paid attention to others as a way of positioning himself, attending to the right people, showing interest in the right topics, demonstrating knowledge of the right cultural touchstones. All of this signaled his suitability for inclusion in the circles that mattered. And he learned to ration his own attention carefully. To pay too much attention to someone of lower status was to risk association with them, to suggest that you considered them your equal when they were not. To pay too little attention to someone of higher status was to appear insolent, unaware of your proper place, lacking in the deference that maintained the social order. The result was a constant calculation. Every interaction involved decisions about how much attention to offer and how much to accept, how much interest to show and how much indifference to perform, how much acknowledgment to provide and how much to withhold. And because everyone was performing these calculations simultaneously, the entire social environment became a complex system of exchanges, with attention flowing along established channels, pooling around certain individuals, draining away from others, creating patterns that reinforced existing hierarchies while allowing for limited movement up or down depending on how skillfully you managed your attention economy. Some people accumulated attention. They became centers of social gravity, people whose presence at an event guaranteed its success, whose approval was sought, whose disapproval was feared. This accumulation was partly a function of rank. A duchess simply had more attention available to her than a baronet's daughter. But it was also a function of performance, of how well you managed the attention you received and how strategically you deployed the attention you gave. A successful social figure paid attention generously, but not indiscriminately. They made you feel seen, acknowledged, valued, but they also made it clear that this acknowledgment was a gift, something they chose to give rather than something you were entitled to receive. They created a sense that their attention was valuable precisely because it was limited, because they could not possibly acknowledge everyone, and you were fortunate to be among the chosen. Others hemorrhaged attention. They paid attention too freely, too eagerly, to too many people, and in doing so, they devalued their own attention. If you acknowledged everyone equally, if you made no distinctions based on rank or worth, then your acknowledgment meant nothing. It became generic, valueless, the kind of automatic courtesy that was socially required but that carried no particular significance. And once you had devalued your attention, it became difficult to reclaim its value. People learned that your acknowledgment could be obtained cheaply, required no particular effort or worth, and they adjusted their behavior accordingly. They might still accept your attention when offered, but they did not seek it, did not value it, did not reciprocate with attention of equivalent value. This created a downward spiral. You paid attention freely, received little in return, increased your efforts to gain acknowledgment, thereby further devaluing your attention, received even less in return, until eventually you found yourself in the position of someone who was tolerated but not desired, acknowledged out of courtesy but not genuinely included. The servants existed outside this economy, or rather, they participated in it in a fundamentally different way. They paid attention as part of their professional function, noticing needs, anticipating desires, remaining aware of everything happening in the spaces they served, but their attention was not valued in the same way. It did not accumulate social capital. It simply performed labor. And the attention they received from their employers was minimal, functional, devoid of the social meaning that attention carried among equals. A lady might speak to her maid daily, might rely on her absolutely, might trust her with intimate knowledge of her life. But the attention she paid to the maid was not social attention. It did not acknowledge the maid as a person worthy of inclusion in her social world. It simply recognized the maid's utility, her function, her role in maintaining the household. This distinction was crucial. Social attention, the kind that mattered in the economy that determined status and belonging, could only be exchanged among equals or near equals. Attention that crossed class boundaries was not social. It was hierarchical, functional, something else entirely, and everyone understood this distinction even if they never articulated it. You could spend hours in conversation with a servant and not feel that you had engaged in social interaction. You could pass 5 minutes with someone of your own class and feel that you had participated in the social world, that you had given and received acknowledgment, that you had performed your role in the complex dance of attention exchange that constituted society. The economy of attention was zero-sum in the sense that attention was a limited resource. You could not pay full attention to everyone simultaneously. You had to choose where to direct your focus, and those choices had consequences. To pay attention to one person meant withdrawing it from another. To include someone meant implicitly excluding someone else. And because everyone understood this, every act of attention was read as a statement of value. If you paid attention to me, you were signaling that I mattered, that I was worth your limited attentional resources. If you withdrew your attention, you were signaling the opposite. This is why the withdrawal of attention was such an effective punishment. It was not merely the absence of acknowledgment. It was the active choice to direct acknowledgment elsewhere, to demonstrate through that choice that you had been evaluated and found not worthy of the limited resource of attention. And there was no defense against this. You could not demand attention. You could not argue that you deserved it. You could only attempt to make yourself worthy of it through performance, through conformity, through the demonstration of qualities that the attention economy valued. But worthiness was never guaranteed. You could perform perfectly and still fail to attract attention if someone more worthy was present, if the social context did not favor you, if those with attention to give had decided for reasons of their own that you were not a valuable investment of their attentional resources. So you lived with uncertainty, with the knowledge that your position depended on the continued willingness of others to pay attention to you, that this willingness could be withdrawn at any time, that you had no control over the fundamental resource that determined your social existence. And you learned to hoard the attention you received, to value it precisely, to reciprocate carefully, to invest it strategically in relationships that might yield future returns. You learned to treat social interaction as a series of exchanges in an economy where the currency was acknowledgment and the price of bankruptcy was invisibility. This was not cynicism. This was simply the way the world worked, and you participated in it not because you had chosen to, but because you had been trained since childhood to understand that this was how civilized people interacted. This was the structure that made society possible. This was the price of belonging to a world that offered security, status, identity in exchange for your complete participation in its mechanisms of control. The landscape of silence. We return, finally, to silence, not as a weapon now, not as a punishment, but as a condition, an environment, the atmosphere in which all of this social life occurred. Victorian society was quieter than we can easily imagine. No ambient noise of machinery, of traffic in the modern sense, of the electronic hum that underlies contemporary existence. Rooms were still. Conversations happened in low tones. Silence itself was audible, palpable, a presence rather than an absence. In this silence, every sound mattered. The rustle of fabric, the clink of teacup against saucer, the creak of a floorboard, the clearing of a throat. All of it registered, was noticed, contributed to the overall impression that you were making on the people around you. And in this silence, pauses expanded. When someone stopped speaking and no one immediately responded, the pause had weight. It occupied space. It became a thing that everyone present had to navigate, had to interpret, had to decide how to fill or whether to let it continue. A pause could be comfortable, companionable, the natural rhythm of conversation among people who were at ease with each other. But a pause could also be hostile, awkward, charged with unspoken meaning. And the difference between these kinds of pauses was subtle, often impossible to determine with certainty, which meant that every pause contained potential threat, potential judgment, potential social death. So, you learned to fear silence, not silence in general. There were appropriate silences, moments when not speaking was the correct choice. But unpredictable silence, silence that you had not anticipated, silence that greeted your words or your presence or your attempt to engage, silence that might mean nothing or might mean everything. You learned to fill silence preemptively. You spoke to avoid the pause that might become uncomfortable. You asked questions, offered observations, maintained a flow of words that kept the silence from settling, from becoming the kind of silence that required interpretation. But you also learned that speaking too much, filling every pause, was itself an error. It suggested anxiety, a lack of comfort with the normal rhythms of conversation, an inability to tolerate the brief silences that allowed for thought, for the transition between topics, for the subtle acknowledgments that occurred without words. So you had to calibrate. Enough speech to prevent uncomfortable silence, enough silence to suggest comfort, ease, the kind of natural confidence that did not require constant verbal performance. The calibration was delicate, required constant adjustment based on the specific context, the people present, the nature of the occasion, and you had to read the silence of others. When someone fell silent, you had to determine quickly whether they were pausing naturally or withdrawing deliberately, whether they expected you to fill the silence or were creating space for their own thoughts, whether the silence was an invitation for you to speak or a subtle indication that you had already spoken too much. This reading happened unconsciously, through years of practice, through the accumulated experience of thousands of conversations. You did not think about it. You simply knew, or you thought you knew, what the silence meant and how to respond to it. But sometimes you were wrong. You misread a pause, filled a silence that was meant to be left empty, or remained quiet when you were expected to speak. And the error created awkwardness, a small disruption in the social flow that everyone noticed and that contributed to their overall assessment of your social competence. In larger spaces, in ballrooms and dining rooms and drawing rooms full of people, the silence was different. It was never complete. There was always the low hum of multiple conversations, the ambient sound of a social gathering. But beneath the noise, there were pockets of silence, moments when the general hum did not reach, when you were isolated with one or two others, and the quality of that isolated silence determined the success or failure of the interaction. And there was the larger silence, the silence of things not said, topics that were forbidden, truths that everyone knew but no one mentioned, feelings that existed but could not be expressed. This silence was structural, built into the very fabric of social life, and it shaped conversations as powerfully as the words that were spoken. You learned to navigate around these silences, to reference them obliquely without ever directly acknowledging them, to communicate through implication and indirection, through what was not said as much as through what was. The skill required for this navigation was considerable, and those who lacked it found themselves constantly committing errors, saying things that should not be said, breaking silences that should not be broken, revealing their lack of breeding through their inability to recognize what was forbidden. The servants moved through a different kind of silence. They were required to be silent in the presence of their employers, to speak only when spoken to perform their tasks without unnecessary sound. But among themselves, in the servants' hall, they spoke freely, and the freedom was precious precisely because it was so constrained in other contexts. They learned to read the silences of their employers differently. For them, silence often meant safety. When the family was not demanding anything, not noticing them, not requiring service, they were free to attend to their own concerns. But silence could also mean danger, the prelude to a complaint, a dismissal, a sudden demand that would disrupt their own plans and rhythms. So they listened carefully to the quality of the silence, trying to distinguish between the silence of contentment and the silence of brewing displeasure, between the silence that meant they were free to go about their business and the silence that meant they should remain alert, ready to respond to needs that had not yet been articulated. And they knew that their own silence, their own discretion, was essential to their continued employment. A servant who spoke too freely, who revealed what they had seen or heard, who broke the silence that protected their employer's privacy, would find themselves without a position and without references, effectively barred from future service in any respectable household. So they cultivated silence as a skill, a practice, a professional requirement, and the silence became a kind of power because it meant they possessed knowledge that they chose not to share, that they held information that could destroy reputations, but that they kept to themselves, that they existed as witnesses to the private lives of the upper classes, but witnesses who had agreed, in exchange for their employment, to remain forever silent about what they had witnessed. This silence was not comfortable. It was not the companionable silence of equals who did not need to speak. It was the enforced silence of people who had learned that speech was dangerous, that certain things could not be said, that knowledge had to be contained, controlled, kept from circulating beyond the bounds of the servant class. And yet the knowledge did circulate through coded language, through careful indirection, through the same mechanisms of implication and oblique reference that the upper classes used to discuss their own forbidden topics. The servants had their own network of communication, their own ways of sharing what they knew without appearing to share it, of warning each other about difficult employers, unsuitable positions, situations to avoid. But this communication happened beneath the surface, in the spaces that their employers did not observe, in the silence that their employers believed was simply the natural condition of the serving class. The deepest silence, though, was not the silence imposed from outside. It was the silence that you imposed on yourself, the thoughts you did not allow yourself to think, the desires you did not allow yourself to feel, the possibilities you did not allow yourself to imagine. This silence was so complete that you were often not aware of it. You simply did not think certain things, did not consider certain options, did not question the fundamental structure of the world you inhabited. The silence had become consciousness itself, the lens through which you perceived reality, the boundary that determined what was real and what was impossible. And this was the ultimate achievement of the system, not the enforcement of behavior, not the punishment of deviation, but the creation of a silence so profound that it shaped thought itself, that determined not only what you did, but what you could imagine doing, what you wanted, what you believed possible. You were silent about the cost of maintaining your position, silent about the exhaustion of constant performance, silent about the fear that undergirded every interaction, silent about the violence of a system that made your existence dependent on the approval of others, silent about the possibility that life could be organized differently, that acknowledgment could be freely given rather than carefully rationed, that belonging could be unconditional rather than perpetually provisional. This silence was not a choice. It was the condition of your existence. You had been trained into it so thoroughly, from such an early age, that breaking it would require unmaking yourself, rejecting the identity you had spent your entire life constructing, stepping outside the only world you knew into a void that you could not even properly conceptualize. So you remained silent. You maintained the performance. You participated in the economy of attention, the hierarchy of acknowledgment, the architecture of exclusion. You lived within the silence, and you called it civilization, propriety, the natural order of things, and the silence continued, expanding, deepening, becoming so total that it was no longer recognizable as silence, but simply as reality, the way things were, the way they had always been, the way they always would be. The persistence of absence. Most Victorians never experienced scandal. They never committed any act dramatic enough to provoke open condemnation. They never defied expectations openly, never broke rules visibly, never gave anyone cause to formally exclude them. They simply lived. They attended their functions, maintained their households, participated in the rituals of their class and station. They dressed correctly, spoke correctly, moved correctly through spaces that were designed to contain them, to channel their behavior along approved paths, to ensure that they remained always within the bounds of acceptability. And yet they lived with fear, not the fear of any specific consequence, but the fear of something vaguer and therefore more pervasive, the fear of becoming invisible, of ceasing to matter, of discovering that they had unknowingly crossed some line and were now on the other side of it, in the cold country of the excluded. This fear was not irrational. They had seen it happen to others. They had witnessed the withdrawal of acknowledgment, had observed people they once knew become people they no longer noticed, had participated in the collective act of erasure that the system required of everyone who wanted to maintain their own position. They knew how it worked. They knew how efficient it was, how total, how devastating. And they knew that it could happen to anyone, that no one was entirely safe, that even perfect performance provided no guarantee because the rules could change, the standards could shift, and what was acceptable yesterday might be unforgivable tomorrow. So they remained vigilant. They monitored themselves and each other. They maintained the performance with a dedication that would have been exhausting if they had allowed themselves to acknowledge the exhaustion. They participated in the system of control because participating was the only way to avoid becoming its target. And the system functioned smoothly, almost invisibly, because it did not rely on force or punishment in any conventional sense. It relied on something far more effective, the knowledge that exclusion was always possible, that invisibility was the inevitable consequence of deviation, that the worst thing that could happen to you was not scandal, but silence, the silence that greeted you when you spoke and no one answered, the silence that surrounded you in rooms full of people, the silence that confirmed more absolutely than any accusation could that you had ceased to exist in any way that mattered. This was the weapon that Victorian society wielded with such devastating effectiveness. Not moral condemnation, not public shaming, not any of the dramatic mechanisms of punishment that we imagine when we think of Victorian morality. Just silence, just the quiet, persistent withdrawal of acknowledgment, just the steady erosion of your social existence until you understood, finally and completely, that you are nothing, that you had always been nothing, that your entire life, your entire identity, your entire sense of self had depended on the willingness of others to see you, to include you, to acknowledge that you existed. And they had decided, for reasons they would never explain, to stop. The performance continued. The rooms remained full. The conversations flowed. The rituals were observed. Life proceeded exactly as it always had. You simply were no longer part of it. You could see it happening around you, could observe the world you had once inhabited, could watch others perform the roles you had once performed, but you could not participate. You had been excluded not through any dramatic act, but through the simple, quiet decision of the group to cease acknowledging your presence. And there was nothing you could do about it. You could not argue your way back in. You could not explain yourself into existence. You could not force people to acknowledge you, to see you, to include you in the social world that had once been yours. You could only accept the silence. You could only learn to exist in the absence of acknowledgment, in the cold space outside the warmth of social recognition. You could only discover what it meant to be invisible while still being present, to be alive while socially dead, to continue moving through spaces that no longer registered your existence. This was the fate that Victorian society reserved for those who transgressed its boundaries, who failed to perform correctly, who lost favor for reasons they might never understand. Not punishment, not condemnation, just silence, just absence, just the quiet, devastating knowledge that you no longer mattered, that you had ceased to be real in any sense that society recognized. And the silence persisted. It filled the rooms you entered. It greeted every word you spoke. It confirmed every fear you had ever had about your own inadequacy, your own unworthiness, your own fundamental lack of whatever quality was required to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be permitted to exist. The silence continued. It deepened. It became permanent. It became you.